Hello and welcome to the Trials Evolution Track Editor Tutorial Series. My name is Cannibal Shogun, and over the course of this series I'll take you through the most basic aspects of working within the editor, all the way up to the most advanced tools and techniques. While similar in many ways to the editor in Trials HD, the Evo editor is a whole new beast, so whether you are new to track building or an old pro, you'll have plenty to learn. Because we have a lot to cover, most lessons will only teach how certain tools or options work. We won't get too in-depth when it comes to specific uses. The goal is to teach you how things work. What you do with them is up to you. If you choose to skip around, each lesson will begin with a list of prerequisites, tutorials from earlier in the series you will need to understand before moving forward. If you start a lesson and you see prerequisites you have not yet learned, we highly recommend you watch those lessons first. You can find all the tutorials online at redlynxtrials.com/tutorials or on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/RedLynx TV. You can also find further information and connect with other people in the Trials community on the RedLynx forums at redlynxgame.com/forum. Now enough with these introductions, let's jump into the editor. Welcome to Trials Evolution. This, our first lesson, will cover some of the basics you'll need to know when working within the Trials Evo editor. To start, from the main menu, scroll down and select the heading Track Central. Within this menu you have four options. Get Tracks will allow you to download tracks from the Trials Evolution Track Central, and Play Tracks will let you play downloaded tracks as well as any of your own shared tracks. Light and Pro Editor are your two options for building tracks. We'll cover the difference between the two a little later when we start to discuss more advanced options. For now, everything we'll be discussing is available in both the Light and Pro editors, so I'll start by selecting Light Editor. Every time you start a new track, you will first be prompted to place 2 spline points. We will discuss spline points further in the next lesson. For now, we'll just place 2 points anywhere using the A button. Before we get into controls, let's take a look at what displays we've got on screen. First, in the upper left-hand corner, we have a pause symbol. This will not come into play until later when we start getting into dynamic physics objects and impulse chains. For now, know that at any point when working in the editor, you can test your physics by hitting the back button, and this icon will turn to the play symbol. Hit back again, and it returns to the pause symbol and deactivates physics in the editor. The next item is the complexity meter. This meter will measure the overall complexity of your map. Once this meter is full, your map has reached the limits. You will not be able to place any more objects, and you might need to scale it back in places to make sure it runs well for users. In the upper right hand corner is your mini-map. This map represents the entire available game world. The white dot represents where you are in the world, and the 2 lines protruding from it represent the direction you are looking. On either side of the screen there is an arrow. We will discuss these in just a moment. At the bottom of the screen are a number of button icons. Depending on what you're doing in the editor, certain buttons will do different things. This display will let you know what buttons do what. Finally, at times the game may need to warn you of a problem with your track. If an area becomes too complex, there are too many lights, you stray too close to the edge of the world, or whatever else you may be doing wrong, a warning in red text will appear in the upper right hand corner of the screen. Now that that's out of the way, we can get started with the basic controls. You look and move around the world using the 2 analog sticks. There are 2 states to the analog, and which state you are in is signified by the 2 arrows on the sides of the screen. When the arrow is curved, the sticks work similar to a first-person game. Left analog moves you around, while right analog looks around and moves the cursor. Clicking in on the left analog stick, L3, switches you to the second state, signified by a straight arrow. In this mode, your view is locked, so the left analog stick still moves you around, but now your right analog only moves your cursor, and if it nears the edge of the screen, it'll move up, down, left, or right, instead of tilting or panning your view. When moving around with the analog sticks, holding right trigger will speed up your movement, while holding left trigger will lock your position. At any point, if you get turned around, you can hit the right bumper to snap your view back to the default position looking at the driving line. One last new thing that a lot of old school Trials HD builders are going to love is the addition of an undo option. Hit X to undo. You can undo up to 20 steps back, and if you accidentally go too far, you can hit Y to redo. Keep in mind, however, that if you undo and then make any changes, you will not be able to redo what you have undone. In this lesson, we will be discussing spline points. Spline points are how you determine the driving line in Trials Evo. Every time you start a new track, it'll prompt you to place 2 spline points. Any track you create will need at least 2 spline points to mark the start and end of the driving line. Adding more spline points will allow you to create a more dynamic driving line with curves. We will begin by opening a new track and placing 2 spline points with the A button. You will notice your first 2 spline points are paired with 2 checkpoints. These are your start and finish checkpoints. Like spline points, you need at least 2 checkpoints in every track to mark your start and finish. The initial checkpoints will spawn lined up with the spline points, but they do not need to be. Your starting checkpoint, finish checkpoint, and any checkpoints in between can be placed anywhere between your first and last spline point. Next, we'll add a curve to our driving line. Select the last spline point by moving your cursor over the spline point icon and hitting the A button. Now we will copy it with the Y button. Spline points cannot be placed from the menu, only copied from your initial 2 points. One thing to keep in mind when copying spline points is that the new spline point will come after the point it was copied from as far as your driving line is concerned. You'll see if I try to place it further back, it creates a sharp turn that you will not be able to ride, and the driving line turns red to signify that there's a problem. Of course, it is possible to put one point behind another, but for now, we'll take our new spline point and place it past the last one it was copied from, and also a bit further back so that we create a curve. Before we continue, let's take a quick look at the spline point icon. There are 2 useful items on the icon. First, it tells you the distance in meters between that spline point and your starting checkpoint. This will come in really handy later when we get into creating skill games, especially ones that use distance as part of the score. The second useful item is this horizontal line that crosses the icon. This line represents the size of your curve. A shorter line is a sharper curve. The longer the line, the wider and smoother the curve. So now, let's go back to the curve we've created. I've purposely made it a little sharp so that you can see how to adjust that. First, grab the spline point icon on the curve. Once selected, the left and right triggers adjust the amount of curve. Left makes it smaller and sharper. You can see here if I hold the left trigger, the horizontal line shrinks to nothing, and the curve becomes a sharp angle, which is of course too sharp to drive, so my line turns red. Right trigger makes the curve wider, and you can see as I hold right trigger, the horizontal line grows and the curve becomes wider and smoother. One thing to note is that the more distance there is between spline points, the easier it will be to get a nice smooth curve. Finally, we'll grab our last checkpoint and copy it. Keep in mind that checkpoints can be copied from existing checkpoints or placed from the objects menu. In any case, your first checkpoint on the driving line is always your starting line, and your last checkpoint is always your finish. So now we'll take our new checkpoint and place it near the last spline point so that we can test our curve. Hit start and select test track and give your curve a test drive. Next, we'll discuss objects. In the editor, pressing up on the D-pad opens the new objects menu. Once opened, you can use the D-pad or left analog stick to navigate the menus. Hit A to select a category. Scroll left and right to check out the subcategories, and scroll up and down to see the objects within them. While viewing an object, you can use the right analog stick to rotate it around, and Y will randomly change its color if its color can be changed. There is also some useful information displayed to the right of the object. Its complexity, mass, hit points, and whether or not it is breakable, can have physics, or change colors are all displayed here. Select an object with the A button and it'll spawn within the world. From there, you can move it around with the analog sticks. Left stick moves it forward and backward, left and right. Right stick moves it up and down, left and right. The A button places the object. Y button will place the object as well as spawn a new one, also known as copying it, and the X button will delete the object. There are a few other things you need to know about manipulating objects in the editor. First, you'll see that once selected, an object is surrounded by 3 circles. These represent the axes on which you can rotate the object. An object can only be rotated on one axis at a time. The current axis will be displayed thicker than the other two, and you can cycle through which one you are using by hitting the right bumper. Rotating the object is done with the left and right triggers. Clicking in on the stick, R3, will snap the object to the driving line. Clicking R3 again will snap the object back to its default rotation. Finally, if you want to select multiple items at once, simply hold the left bumper as you make your selection. When holding LB, you will see a little plus symbol over your cursor to let you know that you're now ready to select multiple items. Many objects will have multiple variations. These could be the same object in different sizes, different versions of one object, or in some cases, different groupings of objects. When viewing objects in the New Objects menu, if an item has variations, it'll be displayed directly above the object. You can scroll through variations using the left and right bumpers, and once you've chosen one, place it as normal. You can also adjust some options once an item has been placed in the world. Selecting an object and hitting up on the D-pad will bring up that object's properties menu. Every item in the game will have some options you can adjust in this menu. In the light editor, there will only be a few options. If the item has variations or can change color, you can do that here. You can also save your object to your favorites, which we will cover a little later. This may only have a few uses now, but as we move into the advanced editor, this menu will have many more options and become very important. In this lesson, we will cover the track settings. There are only a few differences between track settings in the Light and Pro editor, so we will cover both. To access these options, hit the Start button when in the editor, and then scroll down and select Track Settings. The first option will be Game Mode Settings. Select this to enter the Game Mode menu. In the Light editor, you can only create Trials maps, so your game type will always be set to Trials. In the Pro editor, however, you will also be able to select Supercross or Skill Game as well. The second game mode setting is Difficulty. Scroll left or right to choose from Beginner all the way up to Extreme. Try to be consistent when setting your track difficulty. It is good to use the in-game license tests as guides. For example, if your track requires the rider to use skills learned in the A license test, then your track is hard or extreme, no matter how easy it is for you. Your next game mode setting is Allowed Bikes. You can use this to choose what bikes a rider can choose to use on your track. You can allow all bikes, just one, or whatever combination of bikes you like. Whichever bikes have an X in the checkbox will be available to riders to choose from when they play your track. After you've chosen your bikes, you can set your medal times. Be sure to test your track well before setting medal times. If you can, it's always good to get a few people at varying skill levels to test your track. Track description is next. Selecting this will open a text field where you can write a brief description of your track that users will be able to read when browsing Track Central. If you're working in the Light editor, game mode settings end there. But for those in the Pro editor, there is one more option. Game Character lets you choose what your game character is. For normal Trials tracks, you're generally going to want to use the rider or bike, but it is possible to create game modes that don't use the bike or rider at all, like the Sphere Skill Game, for example. In this case, you can choose Custom Object, then use the Select Game Character option to pick your game character. Some items we will discuss a little later, like cameras, can use the position of your game character as a parameter. By setting your custom game character here, these items will automatically know to use your custom object instead of the bike or rider. Our next option under track settings is Environment. In the Light editor, your environment settings are limited to a few presets. First is Time of Day. Time of day basically sets the height of the sun in the sky. Set it towards the middle and the sun will be high in the sky, closer to the edges and the sun will be closer to the horizon, creating longer shadows. Next is Longitude. This determines the angle of your sun. An easier way to think about these two settings is that time of day moves the sun up and down, longitude moves the sun left and right. The last setting is weather condition, which consists of some presets that mainly change the thickness and color of the fog. In the Pro Editor, you can create some custom environment settings, which will get its own tutorial a little later. Our last track setting option is the music playlist. The first checkbox decides whether or not your map will play music. If an X is in this checkbox, your track will play music from the in-game playlists. If you choose to have music, you can then move on to the playlist type. You can choose between two different preset playlists, or create your own custom playlist. If you choose to make a custom playlist, a few more options pop up. The first checkbox determines if your tracks will play in random order or the order of the playlist. The next option, Select Song, will take you to another menu where you can choose which tracks to use from the game's soundtrack. But before you select your songs, you may want to clear the current list. By default, when you select Custom Playlist, it gives you a full playlist. The tracks that are currently in your playlist appear in the box below the Select Song option. You can clear each song with the X button, or use A to replace one track with another. Now that we've covered the basics, we can move to the Pro Editor. First, we'll take a look at some of the options you get when working with objects, so fire up the Pro Editor and let's get to work. We're going to begin by looking at the advanced options we get with most objects in the game. I'll begin by spawning the same object we used as an example when we discussed objects in the Light Editor. All the basic controls for selecting, moving, and rotating the object are the same. The big difference comes when we open the Object's Properties menu. As in the Light Editor, if the item has variations, that'll be your first option. Scroll left or right to choose the variation you wish to use. Next, we have a few checkboxes that are not available in the Light Editor. These are pretty self-explanatory. Visibility determines if the object is visible or not. Generally speaking, you will usually have this box checked so that the object is visible. Physics is the box you will check if you want the object to have dynamic physics. Checking this box means that when the object is within the physics range, it will react to outside forces more or less as it would in the real world. Lock to driving line does just that. Objects with this box checked will stay on the driving line. Keep in mind that for this to have any effect, the object must also have active dynamic physics. The next option on the list is Advanced Physics. This is the menu that will let you really get in there and manipulate how your object reacts when physics are active. If the object is breakable, you will first have hit points. You can adjust this value to determine how much damage the item can take before it breaks. Mass sets the weight of your object. Friction sets how much resistance the surface of an object has to other objects. For example, if we set the friction on a flat plate to 0, the bike or any other object that hits that surface will slide across it as if it were ice. Linear damping can be used to slow down the linear movement of your object. At 0%, the object will react normally. At 50%, the object will move a bit slower. And at 100%, the object will strongly resist any linear movement. Angular damping does the same thing, but for angular motion, or spin. At 0%, the object will spin normally. At 50%, it'll spin more slowly, and at 100%, it will resist spinning at all. Our next checkbox is Disable Global Dampening. Global dampening simulates the real-world forces that would slow an object's movement, like the friction caused by moving through the air. Checking this box disables this force, giving your object a little more freedom of movement. Restitution sets how much bounce the object has. 0 is no bounce, 100 is max bounce. Buoyancy determines how much your object will float in water. A value of 0 will sink right to the bottom. A max value of 1000 will resist entering the water at all and will bounce around on the surface. Disable World Gravity does just what it sounds like. It removes the effects of gravity on that object, allowing it to float around as if it was in space. If you choose to disable World Gravity, you can then choose a custom gravity setting specifically for that item. A negative number will pull the object down. A positive number will actually pull it up. Physics type has a few different settings for your object. Default means the object will behave normally. Contact response means the object will have collision, even if it is invisible. No contact response means the object will not have any collision, even when visible, but can still be used as a hit trigger, which we will cover a little later when we get to triggers and events. And finally, decoration only means the object has no type of collision at all. The main use for this is to improve performance if you have a lot of decoration objects that are slowing your track's frame rate. We have 3 more checkboxes to round out the Advanced Physics tab. Collision sound determines if the object's collision sound plays when it is hit by the bike or other objects. You can select Fast Object to prevent fast-moving objects from going through other objects. However, checking this box can also slow performance. Reset Position and Checkpoint Restart does just what it sounds like. If you reset your rider to the previous checkpoint, it'll reset that object to its starting position. Now that we're done with advanced physics settings, we can back out to the object's properties menu. The last 2 items on this menu are the same as they were in the light editor. Colorize brings up the color picker so you can set the colors of the object. Save to Favorites allows you to save the objects to your favorites, which we will cover in the lesson Gluing, Grouping, and Favorites. In this lesson, we're going to discuss the game camera. You may have noticed that when you place your initial spline point in the Pro Editor, you get a few icons that didn't appear in the Light Editor. 2 of those icons have to do with the game camera, so let's start there. The first thing we'll look at is the blue camera-shaped object that in fact represents your default game camera. We can select this like any other object and open its properties menu by hitting up on the D-pad. FOV, or field of view, is the first option, and it determines how wide the view of the camera is. To some extent, this setting simulates the lens on a camera. A low number is like a telephoto lens, where objects appear bigger, but you can see less of the world around them. As you move up, the lens gets wider. Objects appear smaller, but you can see much more of the surrounding environment. Next we have Move Camera. You can of course move the camera around in the editor just like any other object, but using this option is nice because it gives you a real-time idea of what your camera view will look like. Hit A to enter move mode, then use the analog sticks to adjust your camera's position and the left and right triggers to rotate. Once you like the camera position, hit A again to place it and be returned to the camera's properties menu. This brings us to another submenu, Advanced Camera Settings. In here, we have a number of options to further manipulate how the camera works. Let's run down the list. Assisted. This setting takes in more parameters than simply the camera target's location when it is in motion. It will look at the target object's velocity and the path ahead to try and give the player the optimal view as they play. Follow determines what the camera follows. By default, the camera is set to follow the game character. You can also choose to have the camera follow a different object if you like. Move the follow slider over to object, then use the select follow object option that pops up to select any item in the game world. Now that object is what your game camera will follow. Position behavior determines how the camera reacts to its relative object as that object moves through the track. This is easiest to explain with some visual aids. For this example, the curved line represents the driving line, the circle represents the camera target, and the box with the arrow coming out represents the camera. The default behavior is driving line. With this setting, the camera takes into account the relative object's horizontal rotation. Glue to target reacts similar to driving line, but also takes into account the target object's vertical rotation as well. Keep position does not take into account the target object's rotation, so the camera will always stay in the same angle it is at the start. Set to static, our last behavior option, the camera will rotate to follow the target but will not move from its starting position. Position interpolation determines how quickly the camera adjusts to a moving target. A low number and the camera is slow to adjust and will fall a bit behind a fast-moving target. A high number is quick to adjust and will keep its relative position to its target. Target behavior uses one of the other new icons we have in the Pro editor, this target that appears in front of the rider. This is the point that the camera is fixed on, and adjusting its behavior determines how it will react when the bike is moving. The behavior states for the target are the same as the position behaviors. And of course, you can pick up the target and move it around to adjust where your camera looks. Target interpolation, just like position interpolation, determines how quickly the target's position will adjust to the movement of the object it is tied to. Our next item is called Post Effect. This consists of a number of presets that change things like color saturation, contrast, and tint, altering the overall look you get from the camera. Color tint allows you to put a filter over the camera lens in the color of your choosing. Exposure allows you to adjust the camera's exposure, just like a real camera. Low numbers will result in a darker image. The higher number, the brighter it gets. Our last advanced camera option is depth of field. This is another property that simulates real-world camera lenses. The depth of field of a camera lens refers to how much of the image will be in focus. Selecting this will take you to another menu with a few options. The first checkbox simply decides if the camera will have depth of field or not. Unchecked, everything your camera sees will be in focus. Next, we pick the focus target. This determines where the camera sets its focal distance. With rider selected, the rider will always be in focus. Set it to object, and you can pick any object in the world to be your focal point. Finally, you can select custom value. With custom value, you can set a distance to be your focal point. So, for example, if you set it to 10 meters, all items that are 10 meters away from the camera will be in focus. The other two sliders are near and far blur. Near blur determines where the blur starts between the focal point and the camera. Far determines where the blur starts past the focal point. Once we are done with advanced camera settings, we can back out to the game camera's properties menu. Here we have two more options. Selecting Reset to Defaults will reset anything you may have changed about the game camera to its default setting. Select Show Visualization Always, and some of the visual cues that are normally only visible when the camera is selected will always be visible in the editor, even when you're not working with the camera. When you test or play the track, however, they will still not be visible. In this lesson, we'll discuss the custom camera, which is a camera you can place anywhere in your map if you would like a view different from your game camera. Some common uses for this are to get wider views of big jumps or to get a better look at memorable moments. There are a lot of options in the custom camera, so let's jump right in. First, we will place a custom camera. Bring up the New Objects menu, select the Common Category, Subcategory Game, and from there we can select the custom camera. In the editor, the camera can be moved around and rotated just like any other object. It does have a few extra visualizations, however. The dotted red line represents the center of the frame. If the camera is targeted to an object, which we will cover in just a moment, then this dotted line will connect the camera to that object. The other visualization is the white dotted lines that come out and connect to a rectangle. This represents your range and field of view. Now let's check out the custom camera properties. The first options here are basic object options that we have already covered in the Advanced Object Properties lesson. The next option, Enabled, sets if the camera is on or not. With Enabled checked, when the rider enters the camera's range, the camera will activate. Unchecked, the camera will not activate. This can come in handy if you want to activate the camera based on a parameter other than the game character's position. Next we have Type. Here we have three settings that determine what happens when the camera activates. Interpolate means that the camera will adjust from the view of the game camera. With this setting, the game camera does not appear to change, it simply looks like it moves to the position of the custom camera. With the Cut setting, the camera appears to cut to the custom camera position, just like in editing a movie from one camera to another. Cut and Interpolate combines the two. As the rider enters the camera range, it'll cut to the custom camera position, but as he leaves the camera range, it will interpolate back to the game camera position. I've mentioned it a couple times already, so now let's discuss range. The basic way the camera works is that once the player enters the camera's range, that camera will activate. When the player is outside of that range, the camera is not active. So for example, if the camera is placed 25 meters from the driving line, but the range is only set to 20 meters, then the rider will never enter the camera's range and it will not activate. As I mentioned earlier, the white dotted lines coming out of the front of your camera represent its range. When the player is within the boundaries created by those lines, the camera will activate. In advanced camera settings, we have a few different options than we did with the game camera. Interpolation amount determines how much the game camera changes into your custom camera if you have it set on the interpolation type. Set it to 0 and the rider's view will stay on the game camera. A value of 100 will move the camera fully to the custom camera position. Interpolation speed determines how quickly the camera moves to the custom camera position. A value of 0 will give you a slow, smooth transition. 100 will be very quick. Next, you can choose to have the camera follow an object in the world. This can be the bike, the rider, or any other object you wish. Set the target to none and the camera is static. It will not move or rotate. Set the target to object and then choose an object in the game world with the select target option. Now your camera will stay in the spot where you placed it, but it will pan and tilt to follow the target object as that object moves throughout the world. The next 4 advanced settings, post effect, tint, exposure, and depth of field, are all the same as the game camera options of the same name. Finally, use as game camera speaks for itself. Check this box if you want to use the custom camera instead of the game camera as your default camera. Now, when we back out to the main properties menu, the last 2 options we've already covered in previous camera and object lessons. A very cool addition to the editor in Trials Evo is the ability to adjust the properties of the bike and rider. Let's take a look at that. In the editor, the bike and rider will always appear on the driving line next to the last checkpoint you had selected. So if you can't find him, just select the nearest checkpoint and he should appear right there. Start by selecting the rider and bringing up his properties menu. The first few options are a few basic object properties that hopefully by now you are at least a little familiar with. The advanced physics menu looks a little different than the one we covered in the object properties, but the only real difference is in the way you adjust the values. They all do the same thing as their counterparts in the object properties. Our first new parameter is frozen, and it does just what it sounds like. Freezes the rider, basically removing all physics properties. Generally, for maps that use the rider, you will want this box unchecked. But a bit later, when we get into triggers, events, and data sources, I'll show you how this can be turned on and off during play. And this is of course where the next option comes into play. Unfrozen type determines how the rider will react when frozen is toggled from on to off. With the default setting, when frozen is deactivated, the rider will just have physics return. If he is in the air, he will just drop straight down. But with keep motion, it will remember the motion that the rider had before he was frozen. So for example, if you freeze the rider mid-jump, the game will remember the speed and direction he was heading, so that when frozen is toggled off, he will continue the jump. Invulnerability should be another no-brainer. Check this box and the rider will be invulnerable to damage. Things like the force from explosions or a good healthy blow to the head will not faze him. When invulnerability is off, you can adjust how tough he is. A value of 100 is the default. Turn it down to 0 and the slightest bump will put the rider on the ground. Turn it up to the max and the dude will take a serious beating, but will still eventually fall once he takes enough hits. The next 2 options should also be self-explanatory. Uncheck sounds enabled and the rider won't make any sound. Uncheck rumble enabled and there will be no controller rumble associated with the rider. Finally, we have bailout force. This is the force that is applied when you hit Y to bail out from the bike. 100% is obviously the default. But if you want, you can crank it up so that he really launches off when you bail out. Or you can turn it down to 0, and when he bails out, he will basically just let go of the handlebars. Next, let's take a look at the bike properties. Most of these are the same as the rider properties, but when we get down to the bottom of this menu, we have a few more options. First is engine and braking. In this submenu, you can adjust the power of your bike's engine and brakes. These adjustments will be applied to whatever bike the rider chooses, and in this menu 100% equals the default power setting for the bike. So if you set the power to 150%, each bike will be that much more powerful. But since it's based on each bike's default, the Scorpion, for example, will still be more powerful than the Rattler. The other two bike-specific settings we have to play with are headlight color and intensity. You can use these properties to adjust the color of the bike's headlamp and how bright it is. Keep in mind that the headlamp is a dynamic light. If your track is sufficiently lit so that you do not need the headlamp, for example a daylight track, turning off the headlamp by setting the intensity to 0 could help you get better performance out of your map. This lesson will be an important one for anybody who wants to use physics in their tracks. The way physics work in the Trials Evolution engine is that objects with dynamic physics will only have those physics properties when they are within a designated area. This area is an invisible bubble that follows the rider, but like everything else in this game, you can adjust how it works. To start, take a look at this little red box that is connected to the rider's head with this blue dotted line. This is the center of your physics bubble and the icon you will select to make changes. The first thing you'll notice when you select the icon is a number of dotted lines will appear that create a large sphere around the icon. This is your physics bubble. Any object with dynamic physics properties will demonstrate those properties when inside this bubble. You can move it around with the analog sticks and scale it up and down with the left and right triggers. Keep in mind that scaling the physics bubble up can easily result in performance issues, so use this option sparingly. And if you want objects to move in the background outside of the physics bubble, there are other ways to do this which we will cover later. Now let's take a look at the properties menu. First we have follow. By default, the physics bubble follows the game character, and this is represented by that blue dotted line that connects the icon to the rider. As the rider travels throughout the map, the physics bubble will hold its relative position to him. You can also choose to have the physics bubble follow a different item of your choice. Move the follow slider over to object, then use the select follow object option to pick the object you'd like the physics to follow. Our next item is position behavior. These behaviors are the same as the behaviors we covered in the game camera tutorial. You can also adjust the bubble's size from within this menu. 20 meters is the default size, and as I mentioned earlier, as a general rule, I would recommend not going over that. However, there are of course situations where you may want or even need to make it larger. Reset to defaults will of course reset all of your physics bubbles properties to their default settings, and show visualization always will make your physics bubble always visible in the editor, even when you do not have the bubble's icon selected. In this lesson, we will cover the different options you have when working with multiple objects. In the editor, there are two ways you can combine objects: gluing and grouping. First, let's look at gluing. You can see here I've placed a few objects that I'd like to glue together. There are two ways to glue objects in the editor. The first way is to select all the objects you want to glue. Once you have all your objects selected, hit up on the D-pad. When multiple objects are selected and you open the properties menu, any properties that are shared by all of the objects will appear in the menu, and at the bottom you have your two grouping options, the first of which is glue. Select glue and the items you had selected are now glued. Once the objects are glued, this little yellow square will appear with dotted lines connecting it to every item included in the glue group. This yellow icon also represents the pivot point. Once glued, your objects will now act as one object. Activate physics on it and it will move as one big object instead of a number of small objects. Selecting any object in the glue group will select the whole thing. If you need to select a single object in the group, simply hold LB while making your selection. You can also hold LB and leave your cursor over the group, and after a few seconds it will highlight the whole group. You still need to press A to grab everything, but this is a great way for selecting multiple glued or grouped object sets at once. Now before we get into the properties of a glued group, let's quickly look at the other method you can use to glue objects. If you open the New Object menu, select the Common category and scroll over to the Physics subcategory, there is an item called Object Glue that looks like the pivot point icon. Spawn this in the game world and open its properties. There are some basic object properties and some pivot properties which we will discuss in just a moment, but for now what we need is the Select Glue Members option. Select this option and it will bring up a cursor. Now everything you select with that cursor will be added to the glue group, and for this method you do not need to hold LB as you make your selections. Once you've selected all of your objects, hit B to back up to the glued object's properties. Now that we've got a glue group, let's look at the properties we have for it. The first item we will look at is the pivot type. This determines where your pivot point will be. The pivot point acts as the glued group's center of gravity. Moving the pivot point will redistribute the weight of your glued group and change how your object moves and reacts to outside force when physics are active. Mass center will place the pivot point based on the mass of the individual glued objects. Center will place it based on the position of the objects, ignoring their weight. And finally, with manual, you can place the pivot point wherever you like. Note that it is possible to grab the pivot point in the editor and move it around. If you do that, it will automatically change this setting to manual. Unglue objects speaks for itself. Select this and your glue group goes back to being just a pile of objects. Select pivot is just another way to grab the pivot point. This comes in handy because often your pivot point will be in the middle of an object, making it very difficult to select with the cursor in the editor. With Select Glue Members, you can add more items to your glued group, and save to favorites we will cover in just a moment. But first, let's cover grouping. You can group objects in the same way that we first glued objects. In the editor, select all the objects you want to group, then open the Properties menu. Scroll down and select Grouped Objects, and presto, your objects are now grouped. The big difference between gluing and grouping is that grouping only combines those items in the editor. For all intents and purposes, they are still all separate objects. If you activate physics on the group, when tested, the group will fall apart. It's basically just an easy way to move, copy, or otherwise work with a number of objects at once. As with the glued group, selecting one item in the group will select the whole thing. You can also hold LB to select individual items in the group. There are only a few new options to adjust in the Properties menu. First, just like when we had multiple items selected, any shared properties between all items will appear here. So for this example, we have a bunch of physics properties which we've already discussed. Next we have the option to turn our grouped set into a glued set, and we can of course also ungroup the objects. Remove from group comes in handy if you want to take an object out of the group. For this you will need to use LB to select just the object you want to remove. Open up the properties and hit remove from group. Now that item is no longer part of the group. And finally, we will move on to saving objects to the favorites. The basic idea of favorites is that you can save objects you create in one track to use in other tracks. So for example, I just made this square out of wooden beams, and it's such an awesome square that I want to use it in other maps. With favorites, I can do that. Any object can be saved to favorites, but generally you're going to want to use it to save combinations of objects. The objects do not have to be part of a glued or grouped set to be saved to favorites. If you simply multi-select the objects you want to save, that will work as well. When you select Save to Favorites, you will be prompted to choose a group to save it to. Each group can contain up to 20 favorites, and all groups are available to pull from when editing, so you can organize them however you like. Once you've chosen your group, select Save. You can now give your favorite a name, and after that you're done. Now when you open the New Objects menu, you can scroll all the way to the last category on the right, Favorites, and in there you have your 5 groups as subcategories. In each group you will find whatever favorites you've saved there. Using favorites, you can now reuse whatever cool objects you may create in as many different maps as you like. In this tutorial, we are going to take a look at editor settings. In the editor, hit the Start button, scroll down and select Editor Settings. In here we have a lot of useful options. Let's run through the list. Editor Music lets you control the volume of the music that plays while you edit. Turn it down to 0 for no music, or crank it up and rock out to the soothing sounds of the Trials Evo editor music. Editor map and tips can be toggled on or off with the next two checkboxes. You can also access a list of all the editor tips. Cursor sensitivity adjusts how quickly the cursor moves. Turn it up and the cursor will fly around like it's had a few too many grande espressos, or turn it down to move very slowly, great for fine tuning. Next we have rotate degrees. As I mentioned earlier, when working with an object in the editor, you can use the LB button to rotate an object by 90 degrees. With this option, you can change how many degrees it will rotate. The next few options all have to do with snapping. In the basic objects tutorial, I covered how you can snap an object back to the driving line with R3. Using these options, you can change how that snapping works. Select X, Y, or Z, or any combination of the three, and it will now use the overall world grid to determine where to snap. If you want to use an object you already placed as the base for your snapping, select Snap Work Plane, select Target. This will bring up your cursor and you can select the object you wish to use. Once you've selected an object, it will place a grid based on the position and rotation of the object you selected. Now the editor will snap items to this grid. Keep in mind that the grid and target object are not actually tied to each other. Each can be moved independently without affecting the other. And with that in mind, also remember that if you snap some objects to the grid, then move it, any new objects you snap to it will snap to the new position of the grid and will not line up with the objects you've previously snapped. Our last snapping option is snap distance. When using custom snap settings, this will determine at what intervals it will snap to. The default setting is 1 meter, and each square on the custom snapping plane represents 1 meter. So whenever you press R3, your object will snap to the nearest line on that plane. Keep in mind which snap axis you have selected will determine where it snaps to. Our last editor setting adjusts how the driving line appears in the editor. By default, you get a solid white line that represents the driving line, with a fatter semi-transparent line that roughly represents the width of the bike. Using the driving line alpha setting, you can affect the overall transparency of the line. Set to 100, you get the default look. Turn it down to 0 and the line becomes invisible. Now there are two more options you have when testing tracks in the editor I'd like to cover. Start by entering test mode. Once in test mode, hit the start button and check out the two options at the bottom of the pause menu. Show editor icons will take things that you would normally only see in the editor, like glue paths, triggers, event icons, and effect icons among others, and will make them visible while you are testing. This can come in very handy if you've created something like an impulse chain that isn't working properly. With this option enabled, you can see what is happening while you ride. The extra buttons option simply enables or disables the ability to skip between checkpoints with the bumper buttons while you test. In this lesson, we'll take a look at working with seed buildings. Open up the New Objects menu and scroll over to Buildings. The first subcategory is Seed Buildings. The first type, Background Wooden Buildings, is not like the rest, so we'll skip that one for now. The other 4 styles of seed buildings all work the same. If you're familiar with the Trials HD editor, seed buildings are very similar to the warehouse blocks, but of course you get a lot more control and options. Start by spawning a seed building in the editor. Before you place it, the seed building can be moved around and rotated like any other object. For this example, I'm going to snap it to the driving line and place it at ground level. You'll notice once you place the seed, you can no longer select the whole thing and move it. You can only select individual parts. To make the building bigger, select the wall and hit Y. The building is now 1 block bigger. Hitting X will delete the new block. If you want to grow your building faster, you can multi-select a few walls, or by holding LB and resting your cursor over one wall for a few seconds, it'll automatically highlight every wall on that plane so you can select all at once. Now when you hit Y, it will add a new block to every wall you've selected, and conversely, X will delete every block selected. You can of course also grow the building up or down by selecting the roof or floor. As you add blocks to your seed building, the inside stays completely hollow, so you can now use it to build an interior track. Now let's check out seed building options. Select any part of the building and bring up its properties. The first two options affect the whole building. Select Building Settings to bring up a submenu with a few options for adjusting your building. Re-randomize building will randomly change the variation of every wall in your building. We will cover manually changing variations in just a moment. Most seed buildings have wall variations that are broken or destroyed. The shack is the only seed building with no broken variations. Adjusting the destruction slider will randomly turn some of your walls into the broken variation. What percentage you set it to will determine how many walls it affects. Selecting Colorize the whole building will bring up a color picker you can use to change the color of your building. Finally, we have Physics Type. These are the same options we've already discussed in the Advanced Objects Properties tutorial. Keep in mind, however, that the building itself can't have dynamic physics properties, so this only affects how physics objects will react when they come into contact with the building. Back in the main properties menu, we have one more option that affects the whole building. Select Move Building and it will break your building down to just the block you have selected. You can now move or rotate the block however you like, and when you place it again, the rest of the building will return. The last option will only affect the wall you currently have selected. Wall type is used to determine what type of wall you have. Auto randomly sets the wall. All walls will be normal variations, not destroyed ones, unless you have adjusted the destruction percentage. Solid randomly sets the wall to one of the normal variations. With solid set, this wall will never be set to a destroyed variation, regardless of your destruction percentage. Broken sets the wall to a broken variation. The variation will be decided by the walls that surround it. So for example, if you have two broken walls side by side, they will automatically be variations that visually fit together. Empty gets rid of the wall altogether. And finally, Manual allows you to choose which variation you want. When you set the wall type to Manual, a few more options pop up. The Broken checkbox decides if you are using broken or solid variations. You can then use the variation slider to choose which variation you want. Finally, if you have the Broken checkbox checked, there are some decorations you can add. These are basically broken corner pieces you can use to visually connect some of the broken variations that don't fit together perfectly. One last thing to note about seed wall variations is that different levels have different variations. The first block you place will always be the ground level, regardless of where you place it. Any blocks you add above the initial seed will be upper levels, and every block below will be lower levels. When working with seed buildings for the first time, I would suggest creating a building in each style and check out what kind of variations are available with the ground, upper, and lower walls. Also keep in mind that some styles will also have variations for the floor and ceiling. Next, let's talk terrain. Of course, one of the big changes in Trials Evo is the outdoor environment, and the designers at RedLynx have created a nice big world with all kinds of areas for you to build in. But sometimes you need a hill, a hole, a bump, a ditch, or a road where there isn't one. Guess what? There's a tool for that. Start by opening the new object menu and scrolling over to the environment category. The first subheading is terrain modification, and it only contains one tool, the terrain shaping tool. Spawn one of these in the editor and make sure you have a clear view of the ground so you can check out what it does. We will of course start by checking out its properties. First is the category. This determines what the terrain mod is doing. A few of the categories only affect the texture decal on the terrain. These are surface, driving line, and road and path. The rest will also change the formation of the terrain to create ditches, hills, or ramps, just to name a few. You will notice as you change the category, the second property, decal, will have a different number of options. For categories that only change the texture, each decal will just be the different textures you can use. But for the categories that also adjust shaping, there will be different shaping variations with each option as well. When using the tool to shape the terrain, you can also choose to use the terrain's original texture by unchecking the decal checkbox. The colorize option will bring up a color picker you can use to change the color of your decal, and alpha will adjust the transparency of the decal. Finally, with the clear foliage checkbox selected, any grass, bushes, or trees that are within the area affected by the shaping tool will be automatically removed. Now we've covered the terrain shaping tool's properties, but we're still not done. There are a few more important features to look at. First, there are 3 states to choose from when manipulating the tool in the editor. These states can be changed by pressing the RB button. First, we have rotation. This mode is identified by the big red circle that appears around the shaping tool icon. In this mode, you can use the left and right triggers to rotate the shaping tool. You can also use the analog sticks to move it around and R3 to snap it to the driving line. Next is scaling. This has a blue and red line protruding from the icon representing the 2 dimensions you can scale, X and Z. You can use the left and right triggers to scale both dimensions equally. Left trigger scales down, right trigger scales up. Or you can use the right analog stick to scale each dimension individually. Left and right scales the X axis, up and down scales the Z axis. R3 in this mode resets the size of the X and Z axis to their default. The last mode is height, and it is represented by the green line coming out of the top of the icon representing the Y-axis. In this mode, you can use the left and right triggers to scale the height. This mode of course has no effect if you are working with one of the texture only categories. One thing to note is that the height will scale differently depending on which category you have selected. So for example, if you're working with a hill, right trigger will make the hill larger, but if you're working with a hole, right trigger will make the hole deeper. When working with height, R3 will reset the tool to its default height. The last thing we need to cover is layering. Sometimes you may want to have multiple shaping tools in the same area. Say for example you create a hill to drive over, but you also want to place a driving line texture to show the rider where he's going. When placing terrain tools, the layering of the texture decals is decided by the height of the icon. So for our example, we will place the icon of the shaping tool that is making the driving line above the icon of the hill shaping tool. One thing to remember when working with the terrain tool is that when adjusting many of the settings, the texture and terrain will not visually update while you are making adjustments. Only once you've stopped making changes for a moment will you see the results. Now that we're getting into more advanced features, let's take a look at the custom environment settings. Before you go into environment settings, it's a good idea to tilt your view up so that you get a good view of the sky and the ground. This way you'll be able to see all the changes you make. Hit start and navigate to the track settings. Like before, choose environment, but this time, instead of choosing from the presets, we will scroll down and select custom settings. In here we have a number of submenus, so I'm going to try and get through them as quickly as possible. First is time of day. The options in this menu will adjust the look of your sky and environment lighting. Day/night determines if you have a sun or moon in the sky. Notice that when you switch this to night, any option that had the word sun in it changes that word to moon. For the rest of this tutorial, I will refer to it as the sun. Just remember that the sun and moon are interchangeable. Sun angle and longitude both adjust the position of your sun. Keep in mind with this that the visual sun in the sky also acts as the source of sunlight. Sun size changes the size of your sun, and intensity sets the brightness of the light coming from your sun. Sunlight color lets you choose what color your sunlight is, while sun color changes the color of the sun you see in the sky. Sky and ground ambient colors are similar to the ambient light in Trials HD. An easy way to think about it is that this is the light that illuminates areas that are not lit by the sunlight, like shadows or building interiors. You have 2 options so you can create more dynamic looks. To get a good feel for what these lights do, place some objects, then turn your sunlight intensity down to 0 and play around with the ambient light settings a little. Next we have another submenu, Sky Properties. In here we have some options to change the color of the sky. The first 3 options set the sky's colors. You can set 3 colors that will create a gradient or fade from horizon to zenith. The next 3 sliders adjust the appearance of that gradient. Our last time of day setting is star brightness. If you have a night track, you can choose to fill the sky with stars. Use this slider to determine how bright they are. Of course, like real stars, the lighter your sky color, the more difficult the stars will be to see. Now that we're done with sky properties, let's back out to the custom settings menu and choose weather conditions. In this menu, we have a bunch of options to manipulate the look of your fog and clouds. fog color obviously sets the color of your fog. In Trials Evo, the color of your sunlight and the color of your fog will mix to create the actual color your fog will appear to be. You can lower the sunlight's influence or remove it altogether with the fog sunlight influence slider. Fog sky density determines the fog's influence over the sky. At 0, the sky will appear exactly as you set it in the sky properties, but start to turn it up and the fog will start to cover up your sky, and at 100 you will not see your sky at all. Fog density changes the thickness of the fog on the ground, which also changes how far you can see into the distance. In Trials Evo, the clouds move across the sky just as real clouds do. You can use wind direction and magnitude to determine what direction the clouds move and how fast. High and low cloud size basically adjust how your clouds look. Generally speaking, lower numbers will give you bigger clouds, but using the two together you can come up with a lot of different looks. Cloud alpha changes the transparency of your clouds, while cloud brightness determines how white or black the clouds appear. And finally, cloud shadow alpha basically determines how dark the cloud shadows will appear on the ground. Again, we will back out to the custom settings menu and choose our next submenu, water settings. For this, it will of course help if you can see some water. Color adjusts the color of the surface of the water. The next 3 settings affect the look of objects and terrain that are underwater. Substance color changes the overall tint of the water. Substance amount and fade are both used to adjust how deeply light can penetrate the water, or to put it more simply, how deep you can see. Set either to 0 and the water is totally clear, but start to slide them up and you will see how it starts to muddy up and you can no longer see the bottom. Reflection adjusts how reflective the surface of the water is, and wave height determines how high the waves are. The difference between 100 and 0 is a bit subtle. You can't use it to make big waves. This setting is most useful in cases when you have a very shallow pool. Higher waves will make the water look as though it is disappearing underground, so you can turn this down, making the surface of the water more flat. Once more, we will back out to the custom setting menu, but this time we only have 2 more sliders to check out. Max View Distance sets the maximum distance you can see in the game world, while fog will obscure things in the distance. Lowering the max view will make it so that those things are basically not there. Similarly, Max Object View sets the distance at which objects in the world will render. As you turn this down, you can see objects in the distance start to disappear. Both of these last 2 options can be very helpful if your map is having performance issues. Keep in mind, however, that the lower the max distance or object view, the more likely you are to see objects or terrain pop up as you move throughout the track. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the tools we have that affect areas. Bring up the New Objects menu and select Common. From there, check out the subcategory Game. We will be working with the first 3 tools here. The Trials Evo game world comes already populated with all kinds of objects and foliage, some of which cannot be selected with the cursor. If you want to get rid of any of these items, the Area Clear tool is your friend. Area Clear only works on objects that are in the base world, so objects that you place will not be affected. Spawn this tool in the editor and place it near some base world objects or foliage. By default, the Area Clear tool is set to remove trees and shrubs, and the red dotted lines that create a circle surrounding the tool icon represent the affected area. Any bushes or trees that are within that bubble should immediately disappear. Bring up the Properties menu and you can alter the options to be a bit more specific about what is deleted. Trees, shrubs, and grass should speak for themselves, and base world objects is any object that appears in the game world when you open a new track. Next, let's take a look at the Area Condition tool, which is used to alter the environment settings. When you spawn this tool in the editor, it is surrounded by blue dotted lines that create a bubble. This bubble is the area within which this tool is activated. As your target object enters the bubble, the effects will begin to appear. This bubble can of course be resized using the triggers. Keep in mind that this is a global effect. The area only determines when the effect is activated. The changes it makes to the environment will be visible in the entire game world. Now let's open the properties menu and see what we've got. First are some object physics properties that we've already discussed. The first property we're going to talk about is reacting object. This determines what object activates the area condition. By default, it is set to game character. So if your game character is the bike, the area condition will activate when the bike enters the bubble. Active camera uses the position of the active camera. Or you can choose a custom object. Select any object you like, and now that object will activate the condition change. Fade determines how quickly the effect occurs. With the fade set to 100, there's a gradual change. At the outside edge of the bubble there is zero effect, but as you move into the bubble more, the change occurs gradually. Only at the center of the bubble do you get the full new look. Alternately, if you turn the fade down to 0, you will get the full effect as soon as you enter the bubble. The intensity slider will adjust how much of the effect is applied when the tool is fully activated. Set to 100, you get the full new effect. Set to 0, you don't see any change at all. Later, when we get into how to adjust these values on the fly during gameplay, this will be a useful setting for creating environment changes with no need for physics objects. Size is just another way to adjust the size of your bubble from within this menu, and the last and possibly most important option we'll cover is the area condition settings. It is laid out a little differently, but in this submenu you get basically the same options we looked at in the custom environment settings. Go in here to set how the environment settings will change when the area condition tool is active. The last area tool we will cover is the area selector. This tool is used to easily select a number of objects at once. If we fire up the properties, we have a few options. In the variations, we have the option to use the tool as a sphere or a cube. Then we also have a number of checkboxes to determine what objects the area select can select. In the editor, you have two modes to adjust the area. By default, the triggers will scale the area up and down, but you can also switch to rotation mode by hitting the Y button. Now the triggers will rotate the area. There are two ways to use the area selector as well. You can either resize the tool and select everything within it, or move the tool around, selecting everything you want to include. In both cases, you will use the A button to make the selection. Once your selection is made, back out with B, and you now have all those objects selected. You can move them, delete them, group them, or whatever else you might want to do with a bunch of objects at once. The right sound effect in the right spot can really help a track come to life. Let's take a look at how you can add sounds to your track. You've got two types of sound sources, and they're both found in the common game category. The sound source plays a single sound, while sound source looping can play a continuous loop. To begin, spawn a sound source and open up its properties. The first property is category. There are a bunch of sound categories, and as you can see, when you change the category, the number of choices in the next property, sound, changes. Sound is the actual sound that plays, and each category has a different number of sound choices. Generally speaking, you will want the enable checkbox to be unchecked. When checked, the sound will play right away and then be done. So if it's placed later in the track, you may not even hear it. Usually, you're going to want to activate it with an event, which we will cover a little later when we get to triggers and events. Next, we have all its physics properties, same as objects physics. By default, the sound source will take into account the distance between it and the camera when playing the sound, so that closer sounds will be louder than far ones. Check the static checkbox if you want the sound to play at the same volume regardless of how far away it is. Make the sound louder or softer with the volume slider. You can also adjust the pitch of the sound with the pitch slider. The looping sound source has basically the same features, but there are a couple of minor differences. Spawn one and open its properties so we can check it out. First, obviously the categories and the sounds in them are different. Unlike the single sound source, you will often want the looping sound source to be always running, so you will often have the enable checkbox checked. Of course, there are still plenty of situations where you will want to trigger the looping source as well. And there you have it, the basics of working with sound sources. Play around with them in the editor and check out all the available sounds. Next, let's take a look at lights. As we previously discussed, you can adjust the overall lighting look of your map in the environment settings, but oftentimes there will be areas that need some additional lighting, so let's take a look at what we've got. Lights can be found in the New Objects menu under the heading Common, subheading Lights. The first thing to note about lights in Trials Evo is that there are two basic kinds of lights. I refer to these two types as ambient and directional. Let's take a look at each kind and discuss a few uses. Ambient light is emitted from the source in all directions and does not cast shadows. The ambient lights are the point light, torch light, and wall light. There are a couple of differences between some of these light sources, so before we get into properties, let's quickly take a look at those. The point light is light only. It has no visual source that appears in the world. The torch is the other ambient light that is a little different because it also has a flame effect in addition to being a light. The wall light is a basic light fixture that emits ambient light. Now that we've covered the differences, let's take a look at the similarities, the properties. Each light has all the normal object physics properties. The menu item we are interested in now is the light settings option, and they're all pretty self-explanatory. The light enabled checkbox simply turns the light off or on. Light color allows you to change the color of the light being emitted from your source. The light intensity slider basically changes the brightness of the light. And finally, light range decides how far the light can reach. One thing to keep in mind when adjusting light range is that increasing the range can more quickly lead to performance issues. Now let's look at directional lights. These lights emit light in a specific direction like a spotlight and do cast shadows. The directional lights in Evo are the fluorescent light, hanging light, and work light. The headlamp on the bike is also a directional light. The only difference between the three directional lights is the shape of the light it emits and the shadow mask, which creates shadows based on which variation of the light you are working with. I've placed all three so you can quickly see the different shapes and masks. In the properties for these lights, there are a few extra options. Each type has at least two variations, and the light source itself can also be recolored. In the light settings menu, we have all the same settings as the ambient light, as well as two additional settings. Light cutoff basically describes how wide the light emitted is. In lighting terms, this could be referred to as the cone. When the directional light comes out of the source, it starts at a small point and expands as it gets further away, creating a cone of light. The angle of the cone determines how much the light spreads. Set to 90, your cone looks like a triangle with a 90-degree angle at the top. As you lower this number, your cone gets skinnier. Shadow type determines how the light casts shadows. By default, it's set to dynamic, which means it will realistically cast shadows of any object that passes in front of it. Static, however, will look at what objects are in front of the light when it starts, and only cast shadows for those objects. Any object that passes in front of the light during play will not cast a shadow. This type is easier for the game to process and can come in really handy if you're having performance issues associated with lighting. In this lesson, we will look at the forces you can use to manipulate physics objects in-game. There are two types of forces we will cover, and they both can be found in the common category under the subheading Physics. First, we'll look at the area effector. This tool creates an area within which force can be applied to objects. If you're familiar with the wind tools in Trials HD, this is very similar, of course with many more customization options. When I first spawn one in the world, you may notice a bubble made out of yellow dotted lines. This represents the area within which the force is applied. The arrow coming out of the tool's icon is the direction of that force. Now let's check out the properties. As usual, we start off with a few familiar options, so let's skip down. Shape simply determines the shape of the area, sphere or cube. Size adjusts the size of the affected area. Unlike other tools we've discussed with these bubbles, the size cannot be adjusted in the editor with the triggers. Next we have the force settings submenu. In here is of course where we really get to play with how the force works. Directional force is the amount of force applied. There are no real common settings here, as the amount of force you need will vary based on other factors like the weight and momentum of the objects you are trying to affect. Usually this will take a little trial and error to find the best force setting. Rejection force is a little different. Instead of constantly pushing objects in the direction the tool is pointing, it applies force in all directions emanating from the center of the area effector. Fade determines how strong the force is at different points within the bubble. At 100%, the force is strongest at the center while there is no force on the outside edges. At 0%, the force is constant throughout the bubble. We've discussed damping already when discussing object physics. Here there is no difference between linear and angular. You can just increase the overall damping so that when objects enter the area, their movement will be slowed. Inverted reverses the direction of the force, and applied damage determines if the force can damage objects that enter it. For example, a strong force could easily be enough to destroy the bike or knock out the rider. With this box unchecked, objects will feel the full power of the force without any of the pain. And finally, we get to choose affected objects in another submenu. Type refers to how it decides what objects are affected. Include means that whatever objects are selected in this menu will be affected. Exclude means that the objects will not be affected, but any other objects will be. First, you have a few checkboxes for some common choices. Bike and rider should need no explanation. Dynamic objects means any object with dynamic physics active, and particles refers mainly to visual effects like fire, smoke, waterfalls, etc. You can also pick specific objects. With select object instances, you can choose each object individually, or with select object type, you can pick a specific object. So for example, if you point object types to a metal barrel, then any metal barrel that enters that area will be affected. Now let's take a look at the directional force. The big difference here is that the directional force doesn't affect an area. Instead, it can be tied to a specific object to just affect that object or glue group. The force can be connected to an object by gluing, or in some cases you may want to use a physics hinge, which we will cover a little later. Bring up the properties menu and we can take a look at what we've got to work with. In here, the first option we'll look at is type. This determines how the force reacts based on the objects it is connected to. With local, the force is tied directly to the object it is connected to, so if that object turns, the force turns as well. The global setting will always keep the force aiming the same direction, regardless of its affected object's position and rotation. And finally, target will allow you to select an object to aim the force at. If that object moves, the force changes direction to stay aimed at it. Next is force. This is the amount of force applied by the tool. And just like with the area effector, how much force you need depends on what you are trying to do. Finally, also just like with the area effector, inverted reverses the direction of the force. Now we get a little break from the long tutorials filled to the brim with info. In this lesson, we will discuss custom collisions, and I promise this one will be a quickie. In a nutshell, the custom collision object is an invisible object with physics and collision properties. The custom collision can be found in the common category under the physics subheading. In the editor, the custom collision appears as a semi-transparent object covered in a blue checkered pattern, and as you can see, if we scroll through the variations, there are a bunch of different shapes to choose from. Now, I'll spawn one in the game world so we can check it out. The custom collision is more or less like any other basic object. Likewise, when we open the properties, most of the parameters are ones we've covered in the advanced objects tutorial, but there is one difference. Unlike normal objects, the custom collision can be resized. Need a hinge? There's a tool for that. Unlike in Trials HD where there were a bunch of different hinges with different purposes, in Evo we only have one physics joint, and by adjusting its properties you can make it work like any hinge in Trials HD and a whole lot more. The physics joint is found in the common category under the physics subheading. Once spawned in the game world, the joint appears as just an icon. The first thing you need when working with the physics joint is two objects to join together. For demonstration purposes, I've placed a couple flat ramp pieces, so let's open up our joint properties and see what's up. Before we get into the various properties, I'm going to connect our two ramp pieces so that we can see the visualizations that go along with properties as we change them. We'll start by scrolling down to select target 1. Clicking this will bring up a cursor we can use to select our first object. Then we'll do the same thing with select target 2. Now we have a few new visualizations. First, we get two blue dotted lines coming out of our joint icon. These just give you a visual cue that lets you know what items the joint is connected to. The second is this red circle surrounding a small yellow icon. This yellow icon represents the pivot point, or where the actual joint is, and the red circle represents the joint's range of motion. By default, they will be placed at the center point between the two objects, with orientation based on the orientation of the two objects. If you back out of the properties menu, you can of course grab the pivot point to move it and rotate it to get it to the position you desire. The pivot point also has two pink dotted lines that are a visual representation of the connection it has to the target objects. We'll place our hinge and select the physics joint icon so we can get back to the properties menu. The first option is type. This determines how the joint will work. There are 6 options. Rotational hinges rotate on 1 to 3 axes and have a full 360-degree range of motion. Turning hinges rotate on one axis and have a limited range of motion, by default 90 degrees. Point to point is easiest to describe as a weak glue connection. It will resist movement in any direction, but still has a little give. The ball socket rotates on every axis but has limited range of motion, by default 45 degrees. The spring works similar to a spring in the real world. It can be pushed in basically any direction, but it will then push back in the opposite direction. Slider has no rotation, but moves 2 pieces apart on 1 to 3 axes. Next we have presets. These will change depending on what type of joint you are making, but generally, you will get 2 to 3 choices that manipulate range of motion, either by degrees, axes, or the strength of the joint. Properties basically determines how many custom options you have to work with. With simple, you are working with mostly preset settings, but depending on the hinge you may have a few options to play with. Scroll over to advanced and a few more options open up. With user defined, every parameter available for adjusting becomes available. In user defined mode, the joint will retain the presets it has based on what was set before it was made user defined. But at this point, the type is no longer important, as you can adjust the various parameters to make any type of joint you want. From here on out, I'll leave it in user defined mode so we can take a look at all the options. The enabled checkbox is an option we've seen before, but one thing to note with joints is that when it is not enabled, it's basically like it does not exist, so the two parts will simply fall apart as if the joint was not there. We've already looked at selecting targets, so next is linear settings. Most of the settings in this submenu adjust the limits of linear movement. In here we also have another submenu, linear motor. This basically adds force to the joint. For all you Trials HD editors who agonized over creating lifts and moving platforms, with the slider and linear motor, this is now a breeze. The next 6 values will adjust the range of linear movement the joint has on the 3 axes. For rotational joints, all these values will generally be 0. But for springs and sliders, you will need to allow some linear movement, so this is where you can set how much. Next we have linear softness. This determines how strong the connection the joint makes is. A value of 0 is strongest. The joint will resist separating, but at 100 the joint is weak or soft. It will easily be able to be pulled apart. Damping is next, and just like damping we've seen before in other tools, raising the value on this slider will slow the movement of the joint. Our final setting here is restitution. Just like object restitution, this determines how bouncy the joint is when it reaches its limits of motion. Set to 100, the object will bounce some, but set to 0, there will be no bounce. Next are angular settings. This menu has all the same settings as linear, but deals with angular motion instead. After that, we have spring settings. This menu has 3 options. Linear stiffness sets the linear strength of the spring. The higher the number, the more force it will take to push the spring in, and in return it applies more force when it bounces back. Lower the number and the spring will be easier to push in, but apply less force when it pushes back out. Next is angular stiffness. This is of course the same as linear stiffness, only for angular motion. And finally, check the enable checkbox to make your joint a spring. The disable collision checkbox comes in really handy. Check this and the two objects connected by the joint will not be able to collide with each other, but will still retain their normal collision properties with all other objects. For example, it will often be the case that two platforms joined by a hinge will not react properly because they are too close together. With collision disabled, this is not a problem. By unchecking the pivots combined checkbox, you can choose to move the joint's pivots independently. When making rotational hinges, you will generally want the pivots combined, but if for example you are making a spring, you can pull the pivots apart and it's like preloading the spring. The two pivots will immediately pull back together when physics are activated, creating a slingshot effect. Joint strength will obviously increase the strength of the joint. This will be more important when working with some types of joints more than others, and likewise when working with heavier objects connected to the joint. Keep in mind when adjusting joint strength that the more you increase it, the more likely it is to cause performance issues. Finally, just as when we discussed gluing, select pivot point is an easy way to select the pivot point if it's placed in an area that makes it hard to grab. Alright builders, for you pro editors out there, this is going to be one of the most important lessons. Understanding triggers and how to use them with events, operators, filters, and data sources will really open up the possibilities of what you can do in the editor. Before we get into the different types of triggers, we need to discuss how they work. The triggers function by producing an impulse and sending it along to an event or filter. The events and filters all have various actions that they perform, and the impulse is basically a message that says, alright, now it's time to do your thing. The impulse can also be passed along between events and filters, allowing you to create a chain of events that are all activated by one trigger. For this lesson, we will use a simple example, using a trigger to activate a fireworks effect. In the next lesson, we will discuss events in more detail, so for now, I've already placed an effect event and pointed it to my firework effect. Now that this connection is made, the event knows that its job is to activate the effect, but it doesn't know when. That's where the trigger comes into play. The triggers are found in the New Objects menu in the category Triggers and Events, subheading Triggers. We'll start with the area trigger. This trigger activates when the bike, rider, or any object of your choosing enters a designated area, and is most like the triggers in Trials HD. Let's spawn one in the game world and check out its properties. The trigger can have physics properties, so we start with some options that we've seen before. By default, the area trigger appears as a cube, but you have a few other shapes to choose from, and they can be changed with the shape slider. The size of the trigger can also be adjusted. Trigger by determines what objects activate the trigger. By default, it is set to bike and rider, but in this submenu you have a few more options. Type determines how the trigger uses the items you choose. Include means whatever you choose will set off the trigger. Exclude means that anything can activate the trigger except the items you choose. Next are a number of checkboxes that are all tied to common things you may want to use to activate the trigger. Bike, rider, and ground are all obvious. Dynamic object is any object with physics activated, and static object is any object without physics. You can also choose object instances or types. Select either of these options and you get a cursor to select the objects you want. Instances refers to specific objects, so if I point it to a barrel for example, that specific barrel will activate the trigger. Type refers to any object of the same type. If we choose the same barrel using type, now any barrel like the one we selected can set off the trigger. Keep in mind when using type that different variations count as different types, so if you select an open barrel, a closed barrel will not activate the trigger. Now back out to the main properties menu. Next we have hit tolerance. This option determines how quickly the trigger deactivates when the object stops touching it. This will come in more handy when working with hit triggers, so we'll talk about it a little more in just a moment. On hit is the key option here. Select this to choose where your impulse goes when the trigger is activated. For our example, I'm going to point it towards the effect event I placed earlier. You will notice this red line made of arrows is now connecting the trigger to the event. This represents your impulse and the direction it's traveling. The disable after hit checkbox determines if the trigger can be used more than once. With this box checked, after the trigger is activated once, it will not be able to be used again unless the rider resets to the previous checkpoint, or the trigger is reactivated with a state event, which we will cover in a few lessons. Advanced events lets you get a little more complex with how the trigger works. In this submenu, you actually get the choice to send out up to 3 impulses instead of just 1. So instead of just sending out when the trigger is activated, you can send one upon activation, another when your target object leaves the area, and a third that it will be sending when the trigger is not activated. When using the advanced events feature, you don't have to use all options. So if, for example, you only want the trigger to activate when the target object leaves the area, you can come in here to select your impulse target instead of using the on hit option in the main properties menu. Keep in mind when using advanced events, you need to have the disable after hit checkbox unchecked, or it will only send 1 impulse. The reset and checkpoint restart decides whether or not the trigger will reset if the rider resets to the last checkpoint. Next we have the hit trigger. This trigger activates when 2 items collide. The first properties here that we will be concerned with are set hitting objects 1 and 2. Both of these submenus contain basically the same options as the trigger by menu in area trigger. For our example, I want the firework to go off when the bike hits the ground. So I'll set hitting object 1 the bike, then I'll set hitting object 2 to the ground. Now I point my impulse to the effect event and give it a quick test. Before we move on, I'd like to elaborate a bit on the hit tolerance. Say for example, instead of wanting the effect to activate when I hit the ground, I want it to go off when I leave the ground. To start, I will sever the on hit connection to the effect event, then go into advanced events and point on leave to the event. Now if my bike just slightly leaves the ground for a moment, the effect will activate. But if we turn the hit tolerance up, the bike will need to leave the ground for a bit longer before the trigger sends out its impulse. Our next trigger is the interval trigger. Instead of using objects in the world, the interval trigger is based on time. Properties menu, here we come. Start tick is based on the game clock and determines when the trigger will send its first impulse. By default, it's set to 0, so the trigger will immediately send an impulse as soon as the game clock starts running. A tick is basically the smallest measurement of time in the game. There are 60 ticks a second. As you increase the number of ticks, directly below that you will see it displayed in time format. Interval determines how often the trigger will send an impulse. By default, it's set to 1 second, so every second the trigger will send an impulse. Reset and checkpoint restart will roll the start tick counter back to 0 when the rider resets to a checkpoint. Reset when enabled will reset the start tick counter to 0 if the trigger is toggled from disabled to enabled. Even when the interval trigger is disabled, the tick counter will still start running at the start of the game. Using this option, you can make it start counting later. Disable after end impulses allows you to set the maximum number of impulses the trigger can send. Select this checkbox, then set the number of impulses you want. With this unchecked, the trigger will continue to send impulses at the set interval until the game ends. Finally, select event filter is how you choose your impulse target. The player event trigger is a bit more simple. This trigger will send out an impulse based on the actions of the rider. Let's fire up those properties. In here we have only 3 options. Enabled and select event filter we've already discussed. Type determines what actions activate the trigger. Your choices are crash, bailout, flip, or lean. Just as a quick example, we'll make our firework activate when the rider bails out. In the last lesson, we touched briefly on events. Now over the next few videos, we'll take a closer look at the various events that are available to you. Events are basically tools that when signaled by an impulse do something in the game. Some events can be used for multiple purposes, some are more specific in what they can do and can only be used with certain objects. We'll begin by looking at the events that affect the bike or rider. First is the Afterburner event. The Afterburner basically turns your Trials bike into a rocket bike. Flames shoot out of the back and incredible force rockets you forward. What's next? The properties, of course. Open those suckers up. Type determines how the event will affect the Afterburner. Our choices are on, off, and toggle, and these choices are going to be very common as we continue through the events. On turns the event on, off turns it off, and toggle will change it from whatever state it is. So if it's on, it will toggle to off and vice versa. Next is duration. When the Afterburner is activated, this is how long it will last before it shuts off on its own. Force, of course, sets how powerful the Afterburner is, while damping slows the movement of the bike a bit, which makes it a little easier to control when it's being blasted around by rocket power. Finally, we have Select Event Filter. This will let you take the impulse the event receives and pass it along to another event or filter. Every event has this option. Next is the Bike Control event. This event allows you to automatically control some of the functions of the bike and rider. Properties menu, Engage. Type in this event determines what aspect of the bike or rider you're controlling. Your choices are gas, brake, lean, or bailout. The value is tied to whichever type you choose. For gas and brake, it sets how much gas or how hard the brakes are applied. For lean, the value sets how much the rider will lean in either direction. Negative values lean back and positive values lean forward. Bailout has no value. Now let's take a look at the Bike Part Detach event. This event, as the name implies, can be used to detach parts from the bike. What's that you say? Properties? Let's look at those properties. This one is pretty straightforward. Use Select Bike Parts to choose which part you want to detach. You can make just one part come off, or you can choose every part and the whole bike will fall to pieces. Fire event is next, and you can use this one to set the bike or rider ablaze. We start with two checkboxes, bike and rider. By default, both are checked, but if you want, for instance, just the rider to be on fire, you can uncheck bike. Next is type. Here we have the on, off, and toggle options, but we also have a fourth. When you just turn the fire on, it starts at the lowest amount and builds up as long as the bike isn't moving too fast. Using the set type, you can tell it how much fire there is when the effect is initially activated. When using the set type, we also get the fire amount slider. Use this to set how strong the flames are. 0 is the minimum, 1000 is the max. The last event that is specifically tied to the bike or rider is the player event. This event allows you to automatically make the player do a few different things. Let's fire up those properties. Type in this event determines what actions the rider will perform. The first two, unconscious and detach, both cause the rider to let go of the bike. With unconscious, the rider will go completely ragdoll, but with detach, you'll still be able to do a few off-bike actions that are available for the rider, like grabbing objects or curling up into a ball. Reset to checkpoint is basically like a press of the B button, but with one slight difference. When type is set to reset to checkpoint, we get a few more options. Checkpoint index chooses which checkpoint you reset to. The number on this slider will be tied to the number of checkpoints in your map, with 0 being the starting line. The reset physics checkbox determines if the rider resets when he's moved back to the checkpoint. When unchecked, the rider will return to the checkpoint but will not be charged a fault. However, if he was wrecked, he will stay that way. Finally, we have reset to driving line. This is basically the same as reset to checkpoint, except you can reset to any point on the driving line. The driving line index determines where on the driving line the rider resets to. Its values, 0 to 100, are tied to the length of the driving line. So for example, if your driving line is 100 meters long, a value of 1 is equal to 1 meter. The events we will cover in this lesson can all be used to manipulate objects. Some can be used with many objects, some only with specific ones. Let's run down the list. First, we have the break event. This event can be used to break any breakable object in the game, like explosives or wood boxes. You can check out the info provided about each object in the new object menu to determine if it is breakable or not. Our only new property in here is select event targets. Use this to select which object you would like to break. Next is the camera event. As the name suggests, this event is used to activate cameras. Select camera is our only new option here. Use it to choose which camera the event will activate. You can use the color event to change the color of any colorable object. This one has a few options in the properties to look at. First, color will bring up the color picker so you can choose what color the object will change to. The reset and checkpoint restart will return the target object to its original color if the rider resets to a checkpoint. And of course, select event targets brings up the cursor so you can select which objects are going to be recolored. We'll look at the effect event next. This event is used to activate effects. The properties in here are all ones we've seen before, but we'll take a quick look. Type is the off, on, and toggle options. We also have the reset and checkpoint checkbox. And of course, select event targets is how you choose the effect you want to activate. Next we have the light event, which is obviously used to affect lights. Let's check out how. Light event types are the off, on, and toggle options. Next you have the option to change the color of the light. This is the color of the light emitted, not the light source. For that, a normal color event would do. With the change light color checkbox checked, the light color option opens up, and that takes you to the color picker so you can choose the new color of the light. The rest of the properties here should be starting to look familiar. Now we'll move on to the physics event. This event is of course used to activate or deactivate physics on any object that can have physics properties. All of the properties are ones we've already covered. The sound event is next. We should be starting to recognize a bit of a pattern here. The sound event activates or deactivates the sound sources and has the same type, reset, and selection properties we've seen in a number of events now. The variation event is used to change the variation of any object with variations, and we do have a few differences with how this event works. First, there is no type. It always does the same thing, change a variation. So in type's place is variation, and this will be tied to whatever object you are affecting. So if you have no object selected, there will be no options here. But select an object with variations, and this slider will adjust to have the same number of choices that that object has variations. Finally, our last event in this lesson is the visibility event, used to change the visibility of objects. Again, we get mostly the same properties here. The only difference is that instead of on, off, and toggle, the types are visible, invisible, and toggle. There are some events that don't fit nicely into either of the categories we've already discussed, so we'll take a look at those here. We'll begin with an easy one. The end event simply ends the game. You won't generally use this in Trials Tracks, but when you get into building skill games, the end event will be a necessity. No real properties here besides a few basic event options. An impulse to the event ends the game, simple as that. Next we have the game event. As we've covered in some previous tutorials, you have the ability to use custom objects as your game character. This event allows you to change what your game character is on the fly. Properties, here we come. Most of our options here are familiar. The only one we really need to concern ourselves with is game character. This slider decides what you are changing your game character to. Rider and bike are your first two choices, with custom object as the third. When set to custom object, you also get the select game character option, which allows you to choose your custom object. Now we'll take a look at the hit point event. This event can be used to add hit points to any object that uses hit points. Let's see what we have in the properties. With this event, the type determines how you affect the object's hit points. Set will just set that object's hit point value, while increase or decrease will adjust based on the number of hit points it already has. Increase makes it stronger, decrease makes it weaker. The set value event works with data sources, which we've not yet covered, but its functions are pretty straightforward, so we can still take a quick look. The set value event will always be used to change the value in the variable data source. Just as a quick preview, the variable data source is basically a tool used to hold a numerical value that can be used for various purposes, which we will cover in the data source lesson. Now let's check out our properties. Type in this event changes how the event will affect the value that is already in the variable data source, and value sets the value the event will use to do it. Set will simply change the data source value to the value you have in the event. The rest all affect the data source value with math. Increase, decrease, multiply, and divide will all take the value in the event and the value in the data source and use that mathematical function to create the data source's new value. Finally, we have the state event. By this point, we've seen quite a few items in the editor that have an enabled checkbox. The state event affects that checkbox. We have the same type, reset, and select options we've seen a lot of in event properties. In this case, off means the checkbox is unchecked, on means it is checked, and of course toggle simply changes it from its current state. Now we do have one more event that we've not yet covered. The object position event is a pretty advanced tool, and you will need a better understanding of data sources before we can discuss that, so we will save it for a later lesson. Before we get into operations and filters, we really need to discuss data sources. Data sources are tools that can be used to store or create numerical values for other tools and objects to use. Some data sources use mathematics, but don't worry, you don't need to be a math genius to use them. We will get into some uses for these tools in later tutorials as we cover operations, filters, and creating skill games, but I will include a basic example here as well. First though, I'd like to discuss the different types of data sources. Our first data source is the curve data source. This tool can change from one value to another over a set amount of time. Let's peep those properties to see what I'm talking about. To begin, let's skip down a couple options to start and end. These are where you set the two values the data source will switch between. Below them is duration. This is how long the change will take. So, for example, if your start value is 0 and your end value is 60, and your duration is 1 minute, each second the value will increase by 1. Keep in mind though that the value is still changing every tick. The change doesn't have to be a linear one. If we jump back up, we have the curve setting. This affects the speed of the change. There are too many options here to discuss them all, but there are some great resources online that have visual examples of each type of curve. We will share a link to one in the video description. Just for a quick example, let's say we set it to quadratic ease in and out. Now instead of going from 1 to 60 at an even pace, the change will begin slowly, then speed up in the middle, then slow down again as it reaches the end. Offset ticks is an option we've seen before in the triggers tutorial. This is based on the game clock and determines when the change starts. The looping checkbox will loop the data source so that it runs continuously. Now, when we reach 1 minute, the value will become 0 again and start all over. The invert second half checkbox will make your change take half the time, and then during the second half, it will reverse back to the start. So now, using our same example, it'll only take 30 seconds to go from 0 to 60. Then the second 30 seconds, it will go from 60 back to 0. Reset when disabled will reset the data source if you use a state event to disable it. Enabling and disabling this tool with a state event comes in handy if you want to trigger the change instead of having it based on the game clock. And finally, reset and checkpoint restart of course resets the data source when the rider resets to a checkpoint. Next we have the game variable data source. This one uses various in-game sources to get its value. In the properties we have one main option, type. This is where you choose what the data source uses to get its value. You'll notice with type highlighted, you get some text on the right hand side of the screen. This gives you some important info as to what the numerical values associated with each setting are. When the type is set to any of the options that use the controller, you also get a slider to choose which controller it gets the value from. For Trials tracks, you will always be using main, but it is possible to create local multiplayer skill games for which this will be an invaluable tool. The object info data source uses info like position, rotation, speed, or direction of an object to get its value. We only have two options in this property menu. Select object is of course how you choose the object you want to use, and type determines what aspect of the object you want to use as your value. As you can see, there are quite a few options, so we don't have time to explain them all, but I'll try to quickly run through. Position, angle, direction, side, and up, X, Y, and Z values all use the position and orientation of an object in the game world to get the value. Applied force calculates the amount of force being applied to the object. Hit points is of course the number of hit points the object has. Velocity and angular velocity, X, Y, and Z, use the speed of the object or the speed of its rotation on a single axis, while speed simply calculates the object's overall speed. Driving line position of course uses the object's position on the driving line. Next we'll look at the random data source. This one will generate random numbers between two set values at a set interval of the user's choice. Where do we go from here? To the properties of course. Min and max are the two values between which all of your random values will be, and duration will set how often the data source produces a new value. Reseed and seed both have to do with how the data source generates the random values. Technically, you could say that the numbers are not truly random, as the data source uses a mathematical algorithm to produce the values. For this tool, it looks at the minimum and maximum values as well as the seed value. As a result, two random data sources with the same minimum, maximum, and seed values will always produce the same values. If you want to get truly random values, you can change the seed value while the game is running, which we will discuss how to do in just a moment. Finally, we have the variable data source. Basically, this one simply holds one number, not much math involved. Of course, as we touched upon in the events tutorial, you can change the value using a set value event, and that will come into play as we check out the properties. Our first option is value. This is where you set the value the data source will have at the start of the game. If you adjust the value using the set value event, reset and checkpoint restart will reset it back to the initial number you had set. The interpolate checkbox will open up some new options and also has to do with how the data source reacts when the value is changed. On a basic level, this function is similar to those of the curved data source. With interpolation checked, the number will not abruptly change to the new value, but instead will gradually change over time depending on the following settings. Interpolation type is similar to the curve data source, but here you only get two options. Exponential is similar to the curve example I used earlier, a smoother transition than linear, which is a straight change at even speed. Interpolation speed of course sets how quickly the number will change. And finally, max step sets the maximum value the number can change each tick. So for example, if max step is set to 1, then each tick the value will only go up by 1, increasing or decreasing the value by 60 each second. Now that's all the data sources, but perhaps you're thinking to yourself, what the heck am I supposed to do with them? As I mentioned earlier, we will discuss some uses in coming lessons, but for now there is one main thing you need to know, and this is really going to open up the possibilities of what you can do. Just about any option in any properties menu that uses a value, checkbox, or notch slider can be tied to a data source, allowing you to change it during gameplay. If it is a value, of course the value in the properties will simply match the value in the data source. If it is a checkbox, a value of 0 in the data source equals unchecked, while a value of 1 or higher will equal checked. If it's a notch slider, then the first notch will be 0 and each notch after will be 1 higher. So for example, if your slider has 4 notches, they will be valued 0 through 3. Now I'll quickly show one example that I've used quite a few times, creating a zoom effect on a camera by tying the field of view to a curved data source. I've set up my example by placing a camera at the start of the level, targeted to the rider and set as the game camera. I've also already placed my curved data source and set its values. Just to quickly show you, my start value is 57, the default field of view setting on the camera. My end value is 10, and my duration is set to 3 seconds. Now I'll open my camera properties and scroll down the FOV. A press of the Y button brings up my cursor so I can select my value target. For now, we've only discussed data sources, but operations can also be used as value targets. Now when I test the track, we should see a wide camera view that zooms in for a closer look at my rider. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what can be done with data sources and just how powerful this tool can be. Now fire up those editors and show me what kind of awesome stuff you can come up with. In this lesson, we're going to get back to working with impulses and take a look at filters. Filters are all tools used to manipulate an impulse. Our first filter is the game condition filter. This one will let an impulse pass through based on the state of the game. Basically what happens is an impulse enters the filter. The filter looks at a game state of your choosing, and based on whether that is true or false, can pass on or stop the impulse. Let's look at the properties to get a better idea of what's going on. The first property we will look at is type, and this will determine what aspect of the game state the filter is using. The choices are game started, game running, game ended, bronze, silver, gold, or platinum medals. The next two options decide what the filter will do with the impulse. Select true means that if, for example, you have type set to game running, and the impulse comes into the filter while the game is running, it will pass the impulse through to the next event or filter you select. Select false event basically does the same, but bases it on being not true. So with the same example, if the impulse comes in after the game has ended, it will pass through to whatever you've chosen as a false event. Keep in mind here that you do not need to use both selections. If, for example, you want an event to occur if the game is running, but want nothing to happen if the game is over, then you would select a true event but leave the false event empty. Now hopefully that made a little bit of sense, because our next filter, the generic filter, does basically the same thing but uses numbers instead of the game state. Our first property of interest here is the operation. This determines how the filter will compare the two values. The options are equals, not equal, greater, less, greater equal, and less equal. Next we have our two comparison values. Often one of the values will be set manually and the other will be tied to an operation or data source. Of course, both can be tied to a value target, but if both are set manually, the values will never change, making the results the same every time. And just like the previous filter, select true and false event will decide where to send the impulse based on how the two values match up. The impulse clamp filter takes in multiple impulses before it sends one out to the next event. In the properties, min, or minimum impulses to, sets how many impulses the filter needs to receive before it will send one. Max impulses from is of course the maximum number of impulses the filter can send. Wait ticks sets how long the filter has to collect impulses. So for example, by default we have 2 impulses in produces 1 impulse out, with 600 wait ticks, or 10 seconds. If after 10 seconds the filter has only received 1 impulse, it will reset and now has 10 more seconds to get 2 impulses before it sends one out. Our next filter is the impulse delay filter. This one will simply hold on to an impulse for a set amount of time before it passes it along to the next event or filter. In the properties menu, the only new option we have to look at is delay ticks, and this of course sets how long the filter will hold the impulse. The impulse splitter takes in one impulse and then sends out multiple impulses. No new properties to check out here, simply use the select events filter option to select up to 8 events or filters. Our last filter to cover is similar to the first two. The player condition filter uses the state of the rider to filter the impulse. Your types are riding, bailout, or on fire. I hope you're ready for some math, because this lesson is all about operations, and operations are all about math. Like data sources, the operations hold numbers that other tools and objects can use. However, most operations get that number by performing mathematical calculations. First, we have the distance operator. This is the least mathematical of the operations. It simply calculates the distance between two objects. In the properties, we have 3 options to check out. Type determines how the operator will calculate the distance. World uses full 3D space, while plane only uses horizontal distance. Height is not taken into account. The height setting, however, calculates only vertical distance. And finally, driving line only uses the length of the driving line. Select source 1 and 2 are how you choose which items it uses. So for example, if you want to calculate the distance of the bike on the driving line, you could set source 1 as the starting checkpoint, and source 2 would be the bike. One thing to note here is that if one object is static and the other is moving, it's a good idea to select the static object as source 1. For example, with height, the operator takes the height of source 1 and subtracts it from the height of source 2. As a result, if source 2 is below source 1, the value you get will be negative. Next, we'll look at the 2 input operator. As the name implies, this tool will use 2 values to calculate its own value. Our first property is operation. This is of course how the operator will calculate its value. We have many options here that range from simple addition to some more complex calculation methods. Too many to describe here. Check the video description for a link to more info on the various mathematical operations. Next, of course, we have our 2 values. Like the generic filter we discussed in the last lesson, you will always want to have at least one of these values tied to a data source. If both values are manually set, the result of the calculation will always be the same. That leads us to the n input operator. This one is similar to the 2 input operator, but can use many values to calculate its own. The n input operator has a few less operations, but most of the options are also ones that were available in the 2 input operator. Again, check the video description for links if you want a math lesson. Using select operands, you can select all of the data sources and operations you wish to combine. Finally, we have the 1 input operator. This one uses only one value and some math to create a new number. Operation chooses how you will manipulate the value. Again, many different options, so check the links for more info. The operand you're going to want to tie to a data source or another operation. Just like with previous tools, if your starting value is always the same, then your resulting value will always be the same as well. The final 2 subheadings in the triggers and events category have to do with the controller. There is a tool in each category associated with the triggers, bumpers, A, X, and Y buttons, as well as 8 directional inputs for both analog sticks. Keep in mind that in the game, A and right trigger perform the same action. X and left trigger do as well, so there is only one tool for each pair. These tools can be used to disable those inputs, make them constantly on, or even use them for something else entirely. Since they all do basically the same thing, we won't look at them all, but let's spawn one in the editor so we can see what we've got in those properties. Our first option is controller. This of course determines which controller the tool is affecting. Next we have state. The state refers to how that particular button or stick affects the bike. So default means the button works as normal. Stuck means that the button is effectively always on. So for example, with the A/RT button, the gas will be constantly applied, like in the cruise control skill game. Disabled, of course, means that the input will no longer affect the bike or rider at all. The next three options all basically turn the controller input into a trigger that sends an impulse. Use on press to select the event or filter you want to activate when the button is pressed. On down will send an impulse every tick as long as the button is being held down. And on release will of course send an impulse when the button is released. You can choose just one or all three depending on what you want to do. With the left and right analog sticks, we also have one extra option. There are 8 tools for each stick: up, down, left, right, and the 4 diagonals. With up, down, left, and right, you get the added option of including the diagonals, so that, for example, pressing the left and up diagonal will still activate the left action. For this lesson, we'll back up a bit and cover the event we skipped during the other event tutorials. As we discussed in the physics bubble tutorial, objects outside of a certain range simply cannot have physics properties. You can of course extend the physics range, but this can quickly lead to performance issues. However, if you want to make objects move that are outside of the physics bubble, there is a way, and it's called the object position event. When you fire up the properties, you'll see a lot of options we haven't seen before, so let's check them out. The Modify Position checkbox decides if the event will modify the object's position. Local determines what coordinates the event will use to move the object. With this checked, the object's current position is 0 on all axes. When it's unchecked, the event will use the world coordinates. Next we have values for positions on the X, Y, and Z axes. When the event is activated, the targeted object will move to whatever position these values dictate, and this is where your data sources and operations come into play. If you simply put a new value in here, the object will immediately jump to that new location. Sometimes this will be useful, but often you will want the object to smoothly move to the new spot over time, so you'll need to tie these values to data sources or operations. Manipulating objects in this way is very similar to keyframe animation, so for the rest of the tutorial I will refer to this as animation. Before we move on to the rest of the properties, I'll give a few basic examples of different ways you can animate objects. If you're animating the object locally, the easiest way is with the curved data source. I've placed an object here, and let's say I want it to rise up. For this I will tie the y-axis value to a curved data source, which I've previously set up to change from 0 to 10 over 3 seconds. I will then scroll down to select event targets and choose my object. Now we're almost there, but remember, this tool is an event, so it needs an impulse to activate. Also, if it only gets one impulse, it'll only change the position one time to the value in our data source at the time that impulse reaches the event. So what we need is an interval trigger that is sending an impulse to the object position event every tick for the duration of the move. I've already set up my interval trigger to send an impulse every tick and then disable after 180 ticks, or 3 seconds. And now I'll direct it to activate the object position tool. A simple test in the editor by hitting the back button will show the results. Our object will rise up 10 meters. Next, let's consider if we're moving an object globally. A good example of this is getting an object to follow the movements of another object. In my example, the rider. For this, we will need a few data sources as well as an operation. We'll start with 3 object info data sources. I've set each one to position X, Y, and Z and set the target object as the rider's head. Now at this point, I could tie the X, Y, and Z coordinates in the object position event to the corresponding data source, but this would put my object in the exact position of the rider's head, and something tells me he wouldn't like that much. So now I'm going to use a 2-input operator to add a couple meters to the y-axis so that the object will be a bit above the rider's head. Now I'll open up my object position event. First, I'll uncheck the local checkbox. The object info data sources are going to produce the global coordinates of their target object, so we need the object position event to work globally as well. Next, I'll tie the X and Z coordinates to the X and Z data sources, but the Y will use the toInput operator as its value target. Now, all that's left is our trigger. Since in this example we want the object to continuously follow the rider, we need the trigger to continuously send impulses. So we will use the same impulse trigger as before, but this time we will uncheck the disable after N impulses option. One thing you will notice as I begin my test run is at the start the object will snap to the position above the rider's head. This is of course because its starting position doesn't match up with the starting coordinates of the event. I'll cover one more method of animating objects, then we'll get back to the event's remaining properties. This time, we're still going to be moving globally, but instead of having the object follow another object, it is just going to move from point A to point B. For this method, we need two objects in the world to pull location data from, one at the starting position and one at the end. So I'll spawn a dummy object, then copy it and move the second one to my end position. Now we'll need 3 object info data sources for each dummy object, one for each axis. To save time, I've already set these up and connected them to my dummy object. Now we also need 3 curve data sources, again, one for each axis. I'll grab my first curve data source and tie the starting value to the X data source of the first dummy object, and then the end value to the X data source of the second dummy object, and I will also set the duration to 3 seconds. I'll repeat this step with the other 2 curve data sources using the Y and Z object info data sources. Once this is done, I'll connect the X, Y, and Z position values in the object position event to the corresponding curve data source. Our object is already selected and the trigger already set up from the previous example. Now all that's left is a quick test to see how our object will move. There is one last thing to notice that would be useful when animating globally. In both of our global examples, there was a jump at the start of the animation because the X, Y, and Z values of the starting position didn't match up with the actual position of the event. If you want these values to be equal, you can highlight an axis in the Position Events Properties menu and hit the X button. The value will automatically change to the position of your targeted object. You can then take that number and use it as the starting value in your curve data source. Once you've repeated this for each axis, reattach the object position event values to the curve data sources. This eliminates the need for the first dummy object. I hope that gave you a solid idea on the many options you have for animating objects. There are of course other methods, but once you understand the basics of using this event, the possibilities of what you can do will start to expand. Now that was a lot of info, but we've still got a little more to cover. Fortunately, the next set of options work basically the same, but now for rotation instead of position. The Modify Rotation checkbox of course decides if the tool will try to change the rotation or not, and just as before, Local determines if it will use the values of the object as a base or global values. Yaw, Pitch, and Bank refer to the different types of rotation. These are technical terms that have to do with rotation, but the concepts are the same as the 3 axes we're used to working with. Since we're dealing now with rotation instead of position, our values here represent degrees of rotation instead of meters. So a change from 0 to 360 would be 1 full rotation. Besides that, the potential processes of animating rotation are the same as they were for position, so I'll not do any further examples here. All of the remaining options are ones that hopefully are fairly familiar to you by now, so that concludes our lesson on the object position event. The last lesson was a bit of a doozy, so I saved an easy one to follow it. In this lesson, we will talk about checkpoints in the Pro Editor. There's only a few differences, but they can prove to be really handy ones, so let's check them out. First, in the Pro Editor, checkpoints can also be used as triggers. With the Trigger Enabled checkbox checked, you can use the Select Event Filter option to choose an event or filter just as you would with a trigger. Now, when the rider passes this checkpoint, it will send an impulse to the event or filter you selected. We can also choose to make a custom respawn point. This will allow you to set how the rider resets to that checkpoint instead of just placing him on the ground as it normally would. You'll see when the box is checked we get a new icon in the editor that appears under the rider. We can either select this icon using Select Custom Respawn or simply by backing out of the Properties menu and grabbing it with the cursor. The custom respawn has to stay in line with the checkpoint and on the driving line, so we can only move it up and down. And of course the bike must stay parallel with the driving line as well, so we can only rotate it on one axis. Now, when the rider resets to this checkpoint, he will start at the position of this custom respawn point. So there you go, a quick lesson on some extra features in the checkpoint. In this lesson, we will discuss building a Supercross track. There are a few differences between making Supercross and regular Trials tracks, so let's take a look and see what's up. First things first, in the editor, hit the Start button and scroll down the track settings. From there, open the Game Mode submenu, then move the Game Type slider all the way over to Supercross. As you make the selection, you'll get a warning informing you of many of the big differences. As you can see, the full feature set is not available when building Supercross tracks. You cannot apply dynamic physics to objects, and any tools that are associated with dynamic physics are not available. You also can't use triggers, events, and anything else in that category. Any of the objects that are excluded from Supercross will not be available in the new object selection menu. Our next three game mode settings, difficulty, allowed bikes, and track description, are all options we had in the basic track setting tutorial. The final setting here is driving line gap. In Supercross, there are 4 driving lines, one for each player. This setting will allow you to change the distance between each driving line. In the editor, we also have another difference. You'll notice that there are 2 cameras. The blue camera is like the normal game camera and is used for online play. The red camera, that is higher up and further away, is for local multiplayer. When you're testing, you can switch between these 2 cameras by clicking in on the right stick. When building Supercross tracks, it is fairly important to make sure that all the driving lines are the same. It is very tempting to create different paths, but if players feel like one path has an advantage over another, they may not enjoy playing the track. Nobody likes to feel cheated in a multiplayer game. The editor cannot calculate differences in ramps, hills, or other objects on the driving line. However, if the line curves, it does recognize that the line on the inside of the curve is now shorter, and checkpoints that come after the curve will reflect this by adjusting where they are on each line. Finally, when testing your Supercross track, it's a good idea to test all 4 driving lines. At any point during the test run, you can use up and down on the D-pad to switch between lanes. This is it, folks. The culmination of all the knowledge I've attempted to share with you has led us to this point. It's time to talk about building skill games. Building a skill game will require many of the tools we've discussed in previous tutorials. If you're not yet familiar with impulses, triggers, events, data sources, filters, and operators, you're going to want to go back and check out those lessons before you jump into skill games. As I'm sure many of you are aware, in Trials Evo, the possibilities when it comes to skill games are immense. Using the tools in the triggers and events categories, it is basically possible to program your own game that has nothing to do with riding trials, the bike, or the rider. These types of skill games, however, can get very complicated, so in the interest of time, we're going to create a basic skill game using the bike and rider, so I can show you how to actually set up the skill game in the track settings. Coming up with crazy new ways to use this is on you. We're going to build a hill climb skill game. For those of you who are not familiar with Trials HD, the hill climb skill game is simply an uphill track and the goal is to get as high as you can. The rider who reaches the highest point is the winner. There is an example of this type of skill game in the example tracks that you can load up in the editor through the start menu. I've already built the basic logic to score the game, so I'll just quickly describe what is happening here. We've got a set value event that pulls its value from a distance operator and sends it to a variable data source. This event is activated by an interval trigger that is sending an impulse every tick, but first it passes through a generic filter, which checks the value in the distance operator to make sure it is greater than the value in the variable data source. This ensures that the maximum height achieved is always the value in the data source. Otherwise, that value would decrease if the player started to descend. We also have an end event activated by either the player crashing or bailing out. Now that we've got that out of the way, we can check out how to set up a skill game in the track settings. We'll begin by hitting start in the editor and scrolling down the track settings. Then we will select game mode settings, and from there slide the game type slider to skill game. This will bring up the options for creating a skill game. Difficulty, allowed bikes, medal times, and track description are all options we've discussed before. Although one difference in medal times is that this will adjust how you input the values based on what you choose as your primary score. Instructions, just like track description, will bring up the virtual keyboard so you can enter any special instructions the player will need to know in order to play your game. These instructions will appear on screen during the countdown at the start of your game, just as they do for the in-game skill games. Set primary score will bring up a submenu that lets you choose how the game will be scored and how that score will appear on screen for the player. By default, this is set to time. You can also choose faults or data source. In our example, we will be using the height the rider reaches as our primary score, so we will set this to data source. Next, we decide where our score will be displayed on screen. We have 5 options here. Top left, top center, and top right will all display the score as a number in those positions on the screen. Left and right will display as a bar on either side of the screen. You can see a visualization of what each one will look like to the right of the menu as you scroll through the options. The visualization slider lets you change the appearance of the score. For the numerical scores, the options will be different shapes for the black frame that the score appears in. For the left and right, it will change the color and shape of the bar. Again, you can see what these will look like to the right of the menu. Next, I'm going to skip down a few to format. This basically decides how it interprets and displays the values. Our first option, generic, is a basic whole number. Time obviously uses the time format of minutes and seconds and thousandths of a second. And distance uses meters with up to 1,000th of a meter. You will be able to see how this value will be displayed on screen just as you could with placement and visualization. Now we can jump back up to min and max. Using these 2 options, you can set the minimum and maximum score. When using the numerical displays, it's good to make sure the maximum value is at least as high as the highest possible score. However, when using the bar, you need to be a little more exact. If your max score is set to twice as high as the highest possible score, the meter will only ever be able to reach half full. Likewise, if your max score is set lower than the highest possible score, the meter will fill up all the way, but the player will be able to continue playing. Since we're using a numerical score and I don't yet know the max height of the level, I will just set the max to 100. If in testing we find that the player can get higher, then we can come back and adjust it later. The sorting order determines how players will be ranked on the leaderboards. Descending means that the highest score is best, while ascending means lowest score will be the top of the leaderboard. The label will appear on screen with the score. As you scroll through the options, they will appear in the preview to the right of the menu. There are quite a few to choose from. Since our score is based on height, that's what we'll pick. Finally, we'll select our value target. Since our score type is set to data source, we need to let it know which data source to use. Choose Select Value Target, then use the cursor to select our variable data source that's holding the height information. Once we make this selection, the words primary score will appear above the data source in the editor. Now let's back out and do a quick test to make sure it's working. We still have some more options in the track settings, so let's go back in and check them out. Our next option is Set Secondary Score. The secondary score will determine how players who achieve the same primary score are ranked on the leaderboards. Selecting this option will bring up a submenu, basically the same as the one we just looked at for primary score. However, you can choose to have no secondary score, so in type, you will have the extra option of none. For our example, a good secondary score is time, so I'll set that. I'll place it in the center and change the visualization to the rectangle. Minimum value is of course 0, and maximum is automatically set to 30 minutes, which is the maximum time you can use in any game type. For sorting, we set it to ascending since we want the faster times to be best. Now that we've set that up, if 2 riders get the same height, the rider who gets it faster will be first on the leaderboards. Our next 3 options all add additional counters to the game. These counters will not affect the score, but can help the player by giving them visual cues to other things going on in the map. Say for example, we want to also have our rider on fire, and we want to let the player know how closely they are to dying. While you weren't paying attention, I set up the logic for this, which is pretty basic. A fire effect with an area trigger to a fire event will start the rider on fire at the beginning of the level, and we can use the game variable data source set to bike fire amount to track how close the rider is to death. Now back in our track settings, we will select set counter 1. This is again basically the same submenu we had when setting the score. Our type will be data source and placement will be left. Our minimum value is 0, and we know from the game variable data source info that the maximum fire amount is 1000, so we'll set our max to 1000. Format will be generic, and we'll set the label to fire level. And of course, our value target will be the game variable data source that is tracking the bike fire amount. And now we're done. We've created an In Flames hill climb skill game. Let's give it a test run.